If you grew up hearing stories from parents or grandparents who lived through rationing, shortages and blackout nights, you already know that World War II was not only fought on battlefields, it was fought in kitchens, backyards and pantries. Ordinary families learned how to stretch scraps into meals, turn garden produce into winter rations, and survive on ingredients most people today would ignore. In a time when store shelves were uncertain and supply chains were fragile, people did not wait for help. They adapted. What they developed was not desperation cooking. It was practical, disciplined food strategy. In today's world of rising prices, climate disruptions, and growing interest in preparedness, these forgotten wartime recipes offer something rare. Proof-tested methods for staying fed when comfort disappears. In this guide, we will walk through the real foods that sustained civilians and soldiers alike and how you can still use them today. How ration-era cooking turned scarcity into structure and routine. During the war, governments issued ration books that limited sugar, meat, butter, eggs and flour. Families could not simply cook what they wanted. They had to plan. Meals were built around availability rather than preference. This forced a system that modern preppers often overlook. Instead of stockpiling random items, wartime households created rotating menus based on what they could reliably access. A typical British or American home might base 3 or 4 dinners a week on root vegetables, grains, and preserved fats. Meat became a flavouring rather than a centrepiece. For example, a single pound of beef could be minced and stretched across 3 meals by combining it with oats, onions, and breadcrumbs. Today, you can apply this by learning to treat protein as an ingredient rather than the main event. A single chicken can provide broth, meat for stew, and rendered fat if used properly. Why vegetable stews and victory soups kept families alive? One of the most common wartime meals was some version of vegetable soup or stew. These were known as victory soups in Britain and war stews in parts of Europe. They were not bland, water-based broths. They were dense, slow-cooked meals built around potatoes, carrots, cabbage, onions, and any available legumes. A typical recipe began by frying onions in saved bacon fat or dripping. Chopped vegetables were added and browned lightly to release flavour. Water or bone broth followed. Barley, split peas or lentils thickened the mixture. The pot simmered for hours. The result was filling, nutrient-dense and cheap. In a modern setting, this really teaches us the value of slow cooker and one-pot meals. With dried beans, root vegetables and stored fats, you can produce dozens of meals from just a small supply. If you keep lentils, barley and dehydrated onions on hand, you can, recreate this system at any time. How wartime bread and porridge replaced luxury baking is quite a story. Flour shortages forced people to abandon soft white bread. Instead, they used what was called national loaf flour in Britain, or mixed-grain blends in the United States. These flours included bran, oats, and sometimes a bit of potato starch. The bread was dense but, honestly, quite nourishing. Porridge became equally important. Oats cooked in water or diluted milk were eaten morning and night. Savoury versions might include onions, or if you were lucky, bits of meat. Sweet versions used just a little sugar or maybe some dried fruit. To apply this today, you'll want to focus on learning two core skills: baking dense bread and cooking grain porridge well. If you can turn whole grains into reliable meals, you remove a lot of dependence on processed food. A sack of oats and a bag of whole wheat flour can, honestly, sustain a household for months when used properly. You know, dried meat and preserved fats were actually treated as strategic resources back then. Both civilians and soldiers relied heavily on preserved proteins to get by. Things like dried beef, salt pork, corned meat and tinned fish were all pretty common, but honestly, these were rarely eaten on their own. Usually they were sliced thin and added to stews, pies or casseroles, just to make things stretch a bit further. Now, fat was even more valuable, if you can believe it. Dripping, lard, and saved cooking grease were carefully stored in jars. Nothing was ever wasted. Fat provided not just calories, but also cooking ability and, of course, a bit of flavour. Now, just to bring it home, a practical example today is saving all meat drippings, learning basic curing methods, and, keeping canned fish as a staple. Honestly, a few tins of sardines combined with potatoes and onions can produce multiple meals. It's simple, but it works. Let's talk about how wartime mock recipes maintained morale and nutrition. When ingredients disappeared, people, they invented substitutes. Mock apple pie used crackers and vinegar. Mock goose used stuffed vegetables. Carrot marmalade replaced orange jam. These were not gimmicks. They were psychological tools. Familiar flavors kept morale high. In crisis situations, morale is as important as calories, if not more so. So, to build your own crisis kitchen, start with a foundation of grains, dried legumes, root vegetables, preserved fats, and shelf-stable protein. Learn 3 core recipes: a thick vegetable stew, a dense grain bread, and a basic porridge. Practice stretching small amounts of meat. Save fats. Rotate stock. And cook these meals regularly, not just in emergencies. Wartime families were skilled because they practiced daily. Skill, not stockpiles, was their real security. Now, why are these recipes more than just history? The food systems of World War II were not primitive. They were disciplined, efficient, and resilient. They allowed ordinary people to endure years of uncertainty without collapse. These recipes represent accumulated wisdom, forged under pressure. And honestly, in a world that feels increasingly unstable, that wisdom deserves respect. If this guide helped you see wartime cooking in a new light, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, share this video with fellow history and preparedness enthusiasts, and help keep this knowledge alive for the next generation.